Well, I want to welcome this trio to this podcast. In fact, all three of you are, in your own way, you're all iconoclasts. So here's my question right off. At some point in a former life of yours, you were all significant influencers, ministerial people in the whole evangelical space. You could have stayed there comfortably, you could have stayed there and had great fruitful impact on people, but you didn't. How come?
I mean, I feel like Zach is the most influential influencer of us, so it feels like you should start.
Yeah, I spent most of my early life in the Southern Baptist Convention and worked at, during seminary, one of the largest Southern Baptist churches in the world, one of the largest churches in America, about 45,000 members in the Dallas area. And I would say that my role there was I was the senior pastor's intern for about 18 months and then an associate pastor there for about 6 months. And those 2 years of seeing kind of the height of conservative evangelicalism behind the curtain, the way the sausage is made, so to speak, left me at a place where I didn't feel like I could abide that any longer, not even just from a moral standpoint, but even from an ethical standpoint, and certainly from a following Jesus standpoint. So stepping away from that, for me at that point, still meant staying in a version of evangelicalism, more of a non-denominational, purple church, everybody is welcome kind of a space, but that still had some significant restrictions on women, on LGBTQ plus folks, and others that were a little bit more buried beneath the surface. And in that space, I think I found a space where I felt like I could thrive and I could rise up the ranks and pursue some version of the capitalist American dream in church world. And I did that for a little bit, for a few years, but it became really empty really quickly, especially as people that I deeply loved were pushed aside because of gender or sexual orientation or skin color, beliefs, background, experiences that they've had. And at the same time, I was really diving deeply into the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the queer rights movement of the 60s and 70s, and became really compelled by a woman named Fannie Lou Hamer, who was a sharecropper turned activist who stood up at the Democratic National Convention in 1968, I believe, and said, nobody's free until everybody's free. And I began to realize that our freedom, our flourishing is all tied up together. And that I was a part of a system that was preventing flourishing rather than enabling it. And again, I got to a point where I could not, in good conscience, abide that anymore. And so I had to step away kind of fully and completely from that evangelical machine.
Yeah, and I'll dive a little more into that. Let each of you kind of answer my how come question, but I'll come back to some of those things. So, Carrie, you also at one point worked at one of the largest, most influential churches in the country. You then have worked in other significant churches. You were noted in that landscape, sought after in that landscape, well respected in that landscape, and then now here you're the executive director of something called the Post Evangelical Collective. So how come you're not there anymore and you're here?
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear Zach. It's my own kind of unique experience, but a similar trajectory. I kind of found my way back to God as a early 20 somethings at a Southern Baptist church, and then moved to a large influential megachurch in Chicagoland area that actually was really expansive for me in understanding the gospel, in having a more a broader imagination for redemption and restoration, and sort of the vocation of the church and Christ's people. Began to wrestle through the implications of justice, like local justice issues, justice issues globally, and sort of the implications of my theology there. So in a lot of ways, it was formational for me. And then had a just my own experience of then naming some injustice within the culture, and that was not welcomed or warmly received, and in fact came at great cost. I just had a conversation with a woman in a really different way, had a similar experience, where these, I don't know, landmines that you don't know are there get stepped on when you begin to name things or speak up about things. Or I think I was a defect in that system at some point because I was no longer willing to sort of abide by the rules and accept sort of the benefits that come from being willing to show up in those systems in a particular way.
Mm.
My own kind of shattering, speaking up about injustice within that space was not, I had no idea what I was stepping into at the time by naming misbehavior that I experienced. But that led to great loss vocationally and relationally and theologically and sort of all sorts of areas. And in my own shattering through that experience, at the end of the day, I was still so compelled by the person of Jesus and had so much like fire and passion around what the church was intended to be, and naming all of the ways what I experienced there, this was not the church. And so that set me on this interesting trajectory of then trying to wrestle with, well, then what is the church? And I dug into my like indigenous roots and explored some indigenous spirituality. I went to seminary of all places to have it like sort of a container and a space to be exposed to broader ways of thinking, decolonized thinking, excavating sort of our colonial even roots of Christianity. I wanted to understand the history. I wanted to understand what got us to this space so that we can actually reimagine a different way forward. And then I think that the version of faith that maybe I picked up and I'm still putting back together or reconstructing, if you will, it doesn't fit within those old boxes. It doesn't. I wouldn't be validated or endorsed. And even sort of my own journey of connecting to some of the spirit within, that part of my journey wouldn't be validated or endorsed by that system or structure. So I think I live in a space of at times gratefulness for how that had formed me and shaped me. And also I'm longing for a more expansive way of experiencing the divine and what the vocation of the beloved community is today.
Mm-hmm. And Mike, you too, you led for a long time. You led a significant, wonderful church in Southern California. You were that church's beloved pastor, and obviously something is going on in you inside at the same time. And then, you left that. So what happened for you?
Yeah. So I was a part of a movement of the church that been a part of my whole life. It's called the Restoration Movement. And the Restoration Movement actually was never technically considered evangelical. Mark Knoll, the church historian, would never count us as a part of the evangelical movement because we're technically non-creedal. So we've always sort of been on the outside of that, but we were always a part of like the larger cultural evangelical experience. We were in those waters. And I became the senior pastor, lead pastor of a mega church at 29 years old. And I just was not always in the same place where the sort of like collective consciousness of the church was. And we knew that. And I thought that I would be able to bring that church not where I was, but that we'd have enough overlap where we could exist well together. And what happened was over time, I like to say like we were close to each other. But then over time, like I kind of kept moving and growing in a different direction. And I think the church moved and grew a little bit, but not nearly as much as I did. And so there's this large chasm between like the collective consciousness of the church
Mm.
and where I was, and which created frustration in that collective consciousness of the church that I wasn't the kind of pastor they wanted me to be. And it created a growing internal anxiety within me where like I couldn't, in order to lead that community well, I wouldn't show up as my full self. I would like pull parts of me back. And like for me, what's like I was thinking about like maybe something a little bit different of my experience versus Zach and Carrie. Like I hear you both talking about like you're able to sort of maybe like stand outside the system and examine the system a little bit, it sounds like to me. I was in it in a way where like I don't think I was doing that. I think like I just had a natural curiosity and like a natural like wanting to engage the scriptures and keep seeing like where they led me, and they just kept leading me in these other directions that felt like, oh well, this is where we go with this. And as I kept doing that, like I just didn't fit in that space anymore. And so it just kind of hit this breaking point where it wasn't for me that I was like super conscious of say the injustice that we were part of perpetuating or any of that sort of stuff, that it was just like an internal thing in me. And I like to think like I actually 30 years ago would still be a part of evangelicalism because it was a really wide tent. I would have probably been at like the edges of the tent, but I would have been in the tent. And I think the tent has shrunk. And
Mm.
so by the tent shrinking, I found myself outside of it. Not because like I went wandering outside of it, but because the tent actually changed on me.
How so? I mean, that's an interesting thought that I would have been part of that maybe several decades ago, on the fringe certainly, but now it's so narrow. What was or what is the narrowing from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like, and you would know more about this than I do, but I think that there's been right, you have evangelicalism as a reaction to fundamentalism, and then you have almost a fundamentalism takeover of evangelicalism over the last, couple of decades. And so you had this movement that was like intentionally really broad. And you would have Tony Campolo and a Brian McLaren who found themselves within that movement, and a Billy Graham and a Carl Henry. Like you would have these like wildly diverse like points of view about things that all could kind of like exist there together, and who could all say like, hey, I disagree with you, let's write a book together about how we disagree. About like you got Tony Campolo and Brian McLaren writing a book together about at the time their disagreement around LGBTQ inclusion and affirmation. And like it felt like that was such a normal thing to do in that space, like we got room for these. And then and then it um then no longer are those disagreements acceptable, and there has to be a lot more alignment in order to fit.
And the analysis is great. And I guess what I'll add, do you think it's just that? Because not only do you describe, let's say, church and evangelicalism changing, but the culture is changing at the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century. The culture is changing at the same time. So is that i- i- is that what is also pressed in on the tent shrinking?
Yeah, I mean, I would be curious to hear all of your analysis on
Yeah,
this as well.
all of you weigh in thoughts on the
Yeah.
culture, but go ahead, Mike.
But yeah, I mean, I do think so. I mean, obviously, we've got all the stuff about the divisiveness and the way that people move into more like-minded camps now. And even like one of the things that was interesting to me politically, Ezra Klein writes about this in his book, Why We're So Polarized, is that it used to be on your block, like where you lived, you would see people that were just voting very differently. So you'd have all these different yard signs on your block, and you would have to like just in your neighborhood interact with people who had different political views. And what we have now is geographic shifting of people actually moving intentionally to places to be with people who are more like-minded. So we have this like even like physical move of
Mm.
like we're just moving into spaces where we don't create the space for the interaction with people who aren't like us, who don't think like us, who don't have the same experiences, background, whatever that shapes their worldview, and instead we sort of like isolate and yeah.
Mm. Mm. Anybody else thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think evangelicalism is inherently reactionary. So it was built, in the 40s, formalized in the 40s as a makeover of fundamentalism, fundamentalism with a new paint job, I think is the best way to describe it. Fundamentalism had, because of cultural shifts, fallen out of favor in the wider American landscape, and also kind of in the West more broadly. And so you had these very smart, somewhat culturally savvy fundamentalists come together and say, we can no longer lead in this very kind of abrasive way anymore. We need to remake fundamentalism in a much more palatable way. And so that's what they did. That's what the NAE was, the National Association of Evangelicals. They got up in was that 43, I think, and at the very first meeting said, we're rebranding. We're going to take the airwaves. We're going to take the publishing houses. We're going to be on TV. We're going to completely remake and build this empire to make fundamentalist Christianity much more palatable and accessible to your average American who is experiencing massive cultural shifts. And so, but to Mike's point, what they did is they broadened the movement in a way that you see over the next 4 or 5 decades, people get involved who would not have been involved in fundamentalism, because the way the rebranding happened, it ended up working. It was very palatable. And so people jumped in. Isaac Sharp wrote a book called The Other Evangelicals that is about this part of the movement, where you had Black evangelicals and queer evangelicals and feminist evangelicals, all a part of the movement, very much identifying with a lot of like what Bebbington's quadrilateral would define as kind of core evangelicalism. And then they are subsequently pushed out by the fundamentalist power brokers who are actually in charge of deciding who is in and who is outside of evangelicalism. And so I think, to Mike's point, the tent shrinking is not, I think it feels maybe more new to us just because we're in this space and having gone through it somewhat recently. And I do think it's continued to shrink. There has been a continual circling of the wagons, especially since 2015, and Donald Trump's election and the racial justice uprisings of 2020 and some other things that have COVID that has kind of shaken this up a little bit. So you can maybe argue the tent has shrunk more rapidly over the last 20 years. And certainly we have experienced it more directly as people who were inside and outside of it over the last 20 years. But in reality, they've always policed the edges of evangelicalism pretty hardcore. Ask Jen Hatmaker or people like that, right? If they've been policed on the edges. So I think this is always who evangelicals were. But I think there were some of us that were able, all three of us, and maybe you, David, in some level, able to exist in these spaces, right? Even without knowing the full extent of what we were participating in. And I think all you can do is, when you know better, then you have to be better. And I am grateful for choices that you and Carrie and Mike have made, and so many others, to when you realized your participation in and perpetuation of harm that was happening inside of evangelicalism. You stood up and said no and stepped away.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that same movement that you're talking about, Zach, was when that fundamentalist sort of resurgence and rebranding was also this rejection of scientific thinking and more modern ways of thinking and psychology and sociology. And so even hearing you guys sort of dissect this and Mike's thoughts on the tent streaking and the collective consciousness, I do think some of the cultural shifts, David, have expanded the collective consciousness and made that dissonance more apparent. I think that was my own journey, and so many I talked to in a more post-evangelical space, there was some moment of disruption or waking up or awareness to that dissonance. And I think to stay in a system like that requires some level of cognitive dissonance. And if you are no longer, if you begin to wake up and see, you can't unsee sort of the systems and the structures and how those things are threaded together. So I do think that external cultural factors play a part in this, because there was a more broad waking up within that camp, and then the collective consciousness shifting, that the dissonance or the gap becomes more apparent. I think what's difficult for me is I do think this is what it always was. And seeing past the veneer of that rebranding and that repackaging was quite disorienting, right? To see what was sort of under the hood all along. And even the excavating of what got us there. Like that was my own journey of trying to make sense of it and put the pieces back together. I do think supremacy thinking and hierarchy and patriarchy and power and some of those um, some of those paradigms were very prevalent all along and were being perpetuated within that system and structure of evangelicalism.
Mm-hmm. For me, I mean, I was an evangelical for 30 years, and I was a convert to it. I wasn't raised in it. I grew up in New York, was raised Italian Catholic, Spanish Catholic, and it was really my parents' divorce when I was a senior in high school. And I'm using this language on purpose. I converted, and my old evangelical friends are disturbed when I talk about my conversion now so unspiritually, and I talk about it now more psychologically. I was ripe for I grew up in a home that was emotionally distant. It wasn't an abusive home. In fact, my home was dysfunctionally pleasant. It was an overwhelmingly pleasant home, but there wasn't any emotion. So, I hold on to attachment theory and things like that. So that sort of emotional abandonment in my life set me as a solo. I guess I got to make my way through this life. And so when evangelicalism offered me, we love you, because one thing evangelicalism does well, if you wear the team colors and fly the team flag, you will be loved. An arm will go around you and say, welcome, welcome. And then a theology of certainty was balm to a life that was so uncertain. So then I did it. And then the other scary thing about me, I was then good at it. Does that make sense? I was like then talented at it. And some may say, well, those are spiritual. No. I was just good at it. And so I flourished in it, and it was working until it wasn't. And, mine was several things. Mine was one, intellectual. There were some intellectual things about it. I just go, I can't buy this anymore. It doesn't make sense. Like Zach, there were some emotional things. It's hard for me to be part of a faith that says its cornerstone is love, and it's not loving the people that I love or I think need God's love. So there was part of that. And then if I could just say this, I would sometimes come down off a pulpit and go, I don't even buy what I'm saying. Like, it's not, I told them something is true. I told them it's true because it's in the Bible. I told them it's true because God wrote it. That's why it's in the Bible. But that's not my experience. And I go, and I'm the friggin' minister, and that's not my experience. And I talk with people pastorally and ministerially, and what I'm telling them is not true. And so it became a huge dissonance. And so, you guys explained this so well, but I do want to make it personally. My shift away from evangelicalism was personally excruciating. It tore my heart apart. It tore my relationships apart. It put my reputation with my 30-year ministry in the drain. My wife and I didn't go through it the same way or at the same time. I lost incredible friends, and So what were those personal experiences like for each of you? Does anything I'm saying relate? Does that uh yeah?
I mean, I think that's the reality I've heard from everybody we've connected with in this space that has, by definition, post evangelical means that you're moving out of something into something, right? You didn't start in this space, you were somewhere else. And having been embedded in that space, and particularly like most of the folks that I'm connecting with, and probably several of you are too, are people that are leading in this space. So they were leading in an evangelical space,
Mm.
and so yeah, there's all these like it's it's when you are in the ministry space, it's like the way that you make money and who your community is and your belief system and all those things are all sort of like wrapped up together, and you tug on one of those and you have this like falling apart of all of them.
Mm.
And so there's definitely lots of loss. I've stayed, like, I still live where I lived when I was pastoring the church. We're 3 miles from the church that I was pastoring. So there's a lot of stuff here wrapped up in that for us. But I was just thinking as you were sharing, one of the things that's been really important to me in my own journey is the like love and appreciation of that. Like I've got plenty of critique of it, but I also have like I was talking yesterday with somebody I think we all know who's she's a queer female pastor, and I didn't know this. She was telling me this yesterday that her father was vice president of a very well known evangelical organization for quite a while she was growing up. And so I was chatting with her a little bit about that, and she goes, "Look, here's the thing. Like, they didn't have internet then. They didn't have like all these connections, whatever. And this was a group of people who were just trying to do their best. They're trying to do their best to be like a good spouse and a good. And where did they go for that? What was available to them? And they were doing their best with that. And I've come to think about like the story of the dual healing that Jesus does. The blind man who um, receives like partial sight and then receives full sight, and as this like experience as like a picture of a part of the way that we grow and mature, that you have to go through a stage of seeing but not clearly before you can see more clearly.
Mm.
And without having that stage, like you don't get to the next stage without that stage. And so yeah, there's still a lot of like I'm tearing up hearing your story. I'm tearing up like just thinking about some of my stuff, but also like I think I tear up because like I have this deep appreciation and love for so many of the gifts that I did receive there,
That's
that
right.
wish were more like I can bring with me internally, but I can't bring with me like physically.
It's good. It's good. Anybody else about the pain and the loss?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of my journey was speaking up about injustice of a really like prominent, powerful leader in that space. I didn't know that's what I was doing at the time. I didn't know what I was stepping into at the time, but that was like my ejection in a lot of ways. And there was, relational loss. People I had done ministry with for 10, 12 years, people whose my kids were hand-me-downs from their kids, people who were like in the room when my babies were born, that um there was, yeah,
Yeah.
significant relational loss, and just vocational loss, financial loss, the sort of some of the theological foundations that my life was oriented towards, right? Like all of those things, when the sort of the revealing of what was actually there, not what we said, but what we did, which is that's where you find what you believe is in what you do, not just what you say. And so my experience was so different than what I thought we were all committed to, that it was like pulling the rug out from under me. And that was intellectually, that was emotionally, it was relationally, it was theologically, it was, there was a whole season like I could hardly function just to get through it because it was so disorienting and disruptive.
Mm.
And there's, of course, as the putting the pieces back together, or the reconstructing, or like imagining sort of a new paradigm was more expansive, and that's been challenging to people in my life. And there was loss associated with that, with the realignments in my own life to live according to a different set of values, and to want to actually embody and live out those values meant a different way of being. And that was too disruptive or expansive for even the paradigm of marriage that I had at that time. That was very much formed in a more conservative space. And so understanding the gender roles and sort of purpose and intentions behind what marriage looks like and what flourishing looks like within marriage. My husband at the time and I landed in really different places on that, and so it led to divorce. Like there's lots of really practical costs from that.
Mm-hmm.
I have a family member who is still very much in that space, and I think I have to kind of tell a little bit of a redemptive story when it comes to the loss. But she and I, for 6 years, have gone maybe round and round about things that we view really differently. She was really outspoken on social media with a very sort of conservative fundamentalist view. And I would engage from time to time with her in a loving way, or ask a pointed question, and we were just together in February, and she said, "Carrie, I know that we don't agree on things of the faith. Like I have been committed to not costing our relationship." And so trying to push and pull and figure out how to show them that. She said, "I know we don't agree on many of the things of faith, and I really want to be able to write you off, but your love in my life does not let me do that.
Oh,
My
wow.
experience of you, even though we don't agree on these things." So there's been great loss, and there's been moments like that of like, oh, isn't this a powerful expression of what I say I believe, that we can still maintain relationship also with people who believe quite differently.
Man, that's great. Yeah. And I hear the opposite of that and have experienced the opposite of that. So that's wonderful to hear.
Same in
Wow.
lots of relationships, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Zach, what was your personal experience of leaving? What was that like?
Yeah, so many stories come to mind, but I'll tell one briefly. So we had originally started our church. We moved back to Austin in 2015 to start our church called Restore, which launched in February of 2016. And so in 2014 and 2015, as we were, building a coalition of supporters and raising money and trying to move back to Austin to start this church, that was, would not have had the language at the time, but was attempting to be post-evangelical. We still had some evangelical partnerships, including a denomination and a few different church planting networks and things like that. We had been attempted to be as clear as possible around being egalitarian and inclusive and some other things. But to Mike's point, there was a little bit of a different vibe in 2014 and 2015, especially with your more open evangelical churches, that just wasn't as big of a concern at that point, and became a much bigger concern in 2016 when we actually launched. And so we moved back to Austin in 2015. My now 9-year-old was a 1 at the time. He was my oldest child, and he started having some health problems right when we moved back, and started having seizures. And on the day of our last preview service, about a month before our launch, had asleep in his crib, a horrible grand mal seizure, lost consciousness, had to rush him in our own car to the fire station around the corner, where they were able to bring him back to consciousness, resuscitate him, and then take him to the hospital. Myriad of tests and all kinds of things. He was diagnosed with febrile seizures, which are essentially fever-induced seizures for little kids that in underdeveloped nervous systems. He eventually grew out of them at about 6 and is doing well now. Mm-hmm. But worst day of my life, scariest moment of my life, holding my unconscious 1-year-old and thinking he was gone. And there were a group of pastors who came to the hospital and sat with us, prayed with us, that were connected to the denomination that we were a part of, and walked through that with me for months afterwards. So this was at the end of 2015, or excuse me, the very beginning, January of 2016. We officially launched the church February of 2016. Immediately, within a few months, we go under investigation with the denomination because of LGBTQ inclusion in various sacraments and leadership things that we were doing. That's a much longer story, but let me end it by saying the really painful part was in this investigation, I sat in many of an investigatory meetings where I would have to answer questions and was accused of various things. And two of the pastors who came and sat with me in the hospital, who held my hand and prayed with me and laid hands on my son and prayed with him, told me in those investigatory meetings that not only could LGBTQ plus people not be Christians, but people who thought LGBTQ plus people can be Christians can't be Christians. And I remember in that moment saying, "Are you saying that you don't think I'm a Christian?" And they said yes. And it was devastating, honestly. And I was 26. I was so naive and ignorant of how these things worked. These were older guys who'd been around for a while. And I very much saw them as mentors and caretakers and people who I looked up to, and people who, like I said, were with me in the worst day of my life and cared for me and my family. And to hear them just months later say that I was no longer a Christian, we were eventually kicked out of the denomination. I was defrocked and my ministerial license was revoked, and I've never heard from any of them again. That was the last conversation I had where they said I wasn't a Christian. And that kind of stuff, that's just one story. I mean, I've got a bunch of them, but they're devastating, you know, and you don't want to care what these folks think about you. And, you know, you want to wear it like a badge of honor, like, yeah, screw these guys. I don't care if they think I'm a Christian or not. But in those moments when that happens, when it's people that you have deeply cared about and shared life with and have walked through some of the most intimate and difficult moments of your life with, it's painful. Deeply, deeply painful.
And, you know, I still, thinking about all of us back in that place, I know there's still clergy. All of us are clergy and still orbit in that space. There are still clergy in those situations. So, have you experienced these Nicodemus by night conversations where some youth pastor, some board member of a church, some associate pastor, might even be a lead pastor that has to report to the board, and in their own way is going, listen, I am theologically, spiritually where you're at, but if I say something, I have two middle schoolers at home, I'll lose my job or I'm married, my wife's father was the founding pastor of this church. But have you had those Nicodemus by night conversations, any of them?
Is this where we tell all the names of the people
Yeah,
who are
name
calling
names.
us?
Yeah. No, we don't.
I'm just kidding.
Of course, right? Yes,
I've had tons of them. I'm sure. I know Mike and Carrie have too. We call them, like you just said, we call them Nick at Night conversations. And so I'll come home, tell my wife I had another Nick at Night conversation. I had one yesterday with a pastor. So yeah, it's constant.
Do you live in the tension of empathy and judgment? This is what I find in my own heart, is like so much empathy for that space. And also like, we paid the cost. So like, are you going to do it or not? Are you going to be about it or not? It feels like such an honor to enter into that sort of holy space when people are wrestling through that. And I live in between those two, empathy and judgment, as I'm walking with people through it.
Yeah,
for sure.
no,
For sure.
And I think that's very human and very honest in the sense of, I remember I was pastoring a large church in Nashville, my city, and I would have to sit in my office and reading Marcus Borg, Rob Bell. In those days, Rachel Held Evans wasn't even published yet. She was just writing a blog about naughty Mark Driscoll, and reading these things, and then there'd be a knock at my door, and I'd put everything away, but beads of sweat. So, like you, I have great empathy towards our mates who are still in those situations. But yes, and I don't know if it's judgment, but it's come on, Jump, go. Uh, it's not as lonely as it because of people like you. It's not as lonely out there as it used to be, right?
And I have found so much freedom. I think that's the thing that I will, maybe it's scary to even articulate it this way, but there is something that unlocks in the universe when you live according to your values. There's something about the kingdom of God that opens up, and like the freedom and the flow that I feel like I live in, to be able to be fully honest and actually count the cost of making decisions to live in alignment with my values,
Mm,
has unlocked something like in my own life and in my family. And so there's freedom. It's not without cost, but there's so much freedom in sort of making the jump.
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. I think that that is where I try to lead. What I try to lead with too is it's just better over here.
Mm-hmm.
But I think as much complexity as there is with the, Carrie described, I think very well, the feeling of empathy and judgment, or at least the what David said of come on. Another really interesting part of this is I talk with a lot of folks who are trying to balance how long they stay and fight inside of spaces before they leave. Right. So it's definitely talked to a lot of folks who are like, I got kids at home. I can't speak up. I'm reading Love Wins inside of Grudem's systematic theology, so nobody can see it. I do
Mm-hmm.
talk to a lot of people like that. But I also talk to a lot of people
Yeah.
who are like, I've been in this denomination my whole life and I want it to be different and I want to fight and I want to make them kick us out. I don't want to just quit
Yeah.
because I want to make it better. I want to stay as long as they'll have me. Um, and I think, those are really hard places to be, hard conversations to have. Can you leverage any little bit of power and privilege you have for the purpose of betterment in some of these institutions, or are some of them completely just not worth saving and you have to leave and they need to burn down? And, I think that there are a lot of people who are not really involved with any of this in direct ways, who spout really easy answers to this on social media, but don't actually walk through it in the trenches with people, or who have not lived it themselves. And it's a lot more complex when you're
Yeah.
faced with questions like this of people who really want to follow Jesus and do the right thing, but they just feel caught in between these two things.
Mm-hmm.
100%.
Yeah.
I appreciate that, Zach. That I think that it's really, really easy to sit somewhere and lob some stuff at people and it's a different thing to sit in that seat. And I also think there's so many different theories of change. And to put up blinders to think that your theory of change is the only way that change is brought about, I actually think we need all these different ways they all have to be working together. And some of them are going to be big and explosive, and some of them are going to be small and subtle. And they all have to work. They all have to be being done at some level.
Yeah. I think there's two camps
That's
in
good.
this. There's people who want to make change and in their local context are doing that slow and steady. And I think there's a responsibility to, if you're called to shepherd and pastor a group of people, to say, oh, well, if you don't believe in women in leadership, you should just leave. Which I've worked at a church that said that. And I'm like, why? You changed your mind on this. Why would we not hold space for people to grapple with and wrestle with and work
That's
out,
right.
their thinking on that's the responsible stewardship of a local community to engage. The other camp of this is honestly some of my favorite people right now. I could name three different denominations where there are people who are staying and choosing to stay and dissent and are saying, like, I know you want me to leave right now because I no longer, but you don't want to say it out loud, right? Like there's sort of an ambiguous set of values within this denomination. And then when the rubber hits the road, there's that landmine or that, the line that's being crossed. And so these pastors are like, no, I'm actually living in our values. And you have decided I'm not, and I'm not going to leave for the sake of comfort. You're going to have to kick me out. And I
Sure.
mean, it's so compelling to me because they're yielded, humble, faithful leaders who are saying, actually, you have to say the thing out loud because I'm not the one that's dishonoring it. You actually kind of are. So they're choosing to live in that tension, for the sake of change, and have no control over what kind of change it will lead
Mm,
to. But that's the
mm.
kind of courage that I celebrate. And Mike, you're right. This cacophony of change, all of these different ways of embodying it are necessary and stuff like this.
Wow, I mean that's so all of that is so so good. And my church sits right in the heart of Nashville, and you guys know Nashville is the home of CCM music. And let's just be honest, Big Eva it's a powerful machine.
Big Eva.
So yeah, yeah. So I I have I have certain musicians, certain band. Mike likes that.
Well, I said Big Eva at a gathering, and David Gushy was like, Carrie, did you just name it? Did you just name it Big Eva? Like it just kind of fell out of my mouth. And then he was like, why is she a woman though? So now we've changed it to Big Evan. So
Oh, oh, oh,
Big Evan.
oh! He was saying Eva's a woman that you just degraded.
Yes, like
Oh,
we can't
Yeah,
call evangelicalism by a female.
yeah,
Big Eva, it's got to be Big Evan. So David, I support whichever
yeah.
way you
Right. All
go.
right. Well, I said Big Eva, but whatever it gets called, evangelicalism, the machine is a powerful machine, and I think of the CCM musicians. Some in my church have to walk into my church with glasses and a phony nose and a
yeah.
mustache. I can think of there's a major
But that's just
band.
because you require it as a part of
Yeah,
like your dress
everybody,
code.
no more masks now. Now glasses and a funny nose. That's right. And then a major writer that they have to work within a system. They're not a lead minister. They're not a church planter. And yes, I think what we're all saying is we have empathy for those who have to navigate those waters. And hey, true for all of it, right? I got to go on my journey, and it went not my way, but it went the way it went for me, and right. So something is happening. We're talking about an echo of there is something is happening in American Western Christianity. It's real. And so what you guys are clergy in this. You guys are leaders of prominent national organization. What is happening, whether it gets called deconstruction, evolving faith, faith shifting, what is this thing that is happening?
Here's how I think about it, and I don't know. I'd be curious if you all probably have some good pushback on this that will cause me to rethink some of this. Um, I think the process of deconstruction, reconstruction, however, whatever we want to call it, is a natural and normal process that we have always done. We've always gone through it, and we go through it in a lot of areas of our life. It's not simply something that we do with faith. It's something that happens in all the areas of our life, where you build up structures in a certain way to make sense of life because of stages that you are at, developmental stages, and you need those things. You need those things to create foundation structures, scaffolding, and then in order to move into more maturity, some of those structures have to get taken down, but you can't get to that place without those structures there first. So we do it in all these areas. I feel like right now I use deconstruction because it's a colloquial term that we all know and understand, but it's far too destructive of language, I think, to describe what our reality is, because it's actually expansion and growing and normative. And I think I don't know all the reasons why for it. Maybe something with the information age, maybe something with the way we're able to interconnect, maybe even something with the shrinking tent and all that we're understanding around that. But there's such a strong reaction to that thing that is normative and has always been normative, that it's pushed people Um, People who would have found safety to go through that in their church communities no longer have safety to go through that in their church communities, and they're having to find other places to do that. I mean, I think that's one of the things I'm experiencing there. I don't know. Where am I off?
It's completely off. No, I'm just kidding. No, no, not at all. No, not at all. Exact. But here's what I would say. It's not a challenge to it, because I think you're describing something that I fully agree with, and I think whether we look at it anthropologically, sociologically, psychologically, philosophically, and theologically, I think absolutely there's death, resurrection, there is evaluation and change in all things. There's kinetic, and stasis, and boom, boom, boom. Sure. But when we think historically of the Christian church and a major split happening after it was 1,000 years old, and then another major split when it was 1,500 years old, these theological, ecclesiological, cultural events that impact and change Christian spirituality. Do you think we're in something like that? Or you're just describing something that is constant and real, that happens, which I totally agree with. But are we in sort of a neo or new reformation in a sense?
I don't know that I'm smart enough or have the audacity to declare that, honestly. I do think we're in a moment where that sort of movement and transformation has been expedited. I think since 2016, so much of the realities of the system and structure and paradigm that we were in has been revealed, and you can't look away. So you either engage the suffering of waking up and engage the discomfort of waking up and have the audacity or courage or space or necessity to have to reimagine those things, or you double down, right, in order to stay within that. And I do think whatever thread gets pulled for people, the whole thing begins to unravel. And I think that is a gift, the gift of illumination. I don't think the realities that have been exposed are new, but we're being forced to see them or to wrestle with what we see in new ways. And I think that's a gift. And I perceive that this is happening on many different fronts, and that it's even happening sort of globally right now. So what will come from that is yet to be seen. But I do think it's an opportunity for us to lean into it or double down and harden and look away.
Zach, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with what everybody has said, but David, with what you said about how all the different ways that we could approach this conversation, psychologically, sociologically, anthropologically. But I wonder, I mean, Phyllis Tickle, right, in The Great Emergence talked about the 500-year Reformation every 500 years, which is about right now. I think there's something to that. I think Carrie's exactly right that there is a revealing and exposing happening more than a shift when it comes to evangelicalism, specifically related to what I talked about earlier with what evangelicalism has always been. I think a lot about, Dr. King talked quite a bit about the white backlash that happened obviously post-emancipation with Jim Crow, but also post the 60s and 70s after the civil rights movement. And in his final book, he has a whole chapter called White Backlash that he talks about. It's called Where Do We Go From Here? It's an incredible book. But he talks about the white backlash. And I think we saw that with the election of Barack Obama, the white backlash we've been enduring since then, 2015 and 2016. I think Trump is a huge part of that. I think those factors did a lot of the revealing that we are seeing. And this is what has become what David Gushee calls, this evangelical refugee crisis, that people are fleeing evangelicalism in massive numbers because there are so many of them to begin with. And to connect one more little thread, Mike mentioned earlier Ezra Klein's book, Why We're Polarized. He quotes Bill Bishop's book, The Big Sort, talking about people moving in specifically around others who ideologically align with them, like in physical spaces. That's true, but we've also, Ezra talks about us building these things called mega identities, which is that we are this kind of one big thing, and there are all these pieces of it, and it allows us to categorize people much easier. So whereas before you might have a church that is made up of people who are in different places around things like evolution or like the fundamentalist modernist controversies of the 20s, 30s, and 40s, maybe political party affiliation, maybe even, we saw this a lot in like the 40s, 50s, 60s around abortion issues. You had a lot of diversity in Christian thought, even the Southern Baptist Convention passing resolutions that we would call pro-choice today. And so you had a lot of diversity of thought when it came to a bunch of different things. But over these last 20 years, as this sorting has happened, we have developed these, well, if you are this, then it means all of these different things. And so if you are an evangelical, it means that you think this about COVID and this about race and this about gender and sexuality and this about trans rights and this about women in leadership and this. And so if any of those things fall apart for someone, if they don't match up in one of those spaces and they pull at that little thread and the whole thing starts to unravel, then they feel the need to either remove themselves and or they are pushed out of that mega identity because they no longer check all the boxes. And David, what you said earlier about when you wear the shirt and you check the boxes and you put the hat on, you are embraced, right? But as soon as you, like we have all experienced, speak up, speak out, take a step that's a little bit off what you've been told to do, you are pushed out very quickly because fundamentalism does not work if the boundaries are not policed, right?
Yes.
They have to be policed so rigidly or the whole thing falls apart. And so because the evangelical mega identity has continued to spread and become so much bigger and you have to check so many boxes, there are people who just cannot abide it anymore, cannot fit in it anymore. And they are fleeing. At the same time, this last thing I'll say about this, fascinating to watch all of these people who would not call themselves Christians, would not be a part of churches, would maybe even be, there's an article recently with some research about people who are Muslims or Buddhists identifying as evangelicals also, because they check all of the different boxes. Because for evangelicalism in 2024, there really is not a Jesus box to check, except to maybe, put a flag out in front of your house and say that you're a Christian or whatever, right? But there's no actual following the way of Jesus box to check. And so you could be an atheist, a Muslim, a Buddhist, and if you think the way we think about all these social issues, the way that evangelicals think, then you can be a part of the club. And it's just a wild thing to behold.
Yeah. No. Well.
Baptize me again right now.
Yeah.
We're all going to convert.
Yeah. No. The analysis is spot on. So Zach, So to Gushee's term, evangelical refugee, why the mass refugee exit from those boxes? Is the mass exodus they're leaving due to evangelicalism's tethering to partisan politics? Is it certain social issues don't speak generosity in their culture? Is it theological / intellectual, or is it spiritual that there isn't a spiritual connection? What is it? Or I think, that?
Yeah, I think it's all of it. Anecdotally, from the people that I talk to in our church and online week in and week out, there's always an initial piece, right? There's something that falls apart. For a lot of people, it was, 81% evangelical, white evangelical Trump support in 2016. as a huge one, right? A lot of it was churches reopening after 2 weeks post-COVID. A lot of them was the 2020 murders of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, and a lot of Christian leaders' responses to that were either completely ignoring it or, continuing to enable racial injustice, perpetuate it. Whatever that first piece was, I think because of the mega identity, as soon as a little bit starts to change or unravel, you are both pushed and pulled outside of evangelicalism almost immediately. So if you don't check all of the boxes and line up in all the ways, then there is a pressure to leave. And like I said, it's a push and a pull. So you feel, I think the way it's described to me is an internal need to leave, but then you also feel an external pushing out of it if you are no longer checking the boxes. And because we're humans and we're interconnected, holistic beings, when one thing starts to change, we begin to examine other things. And that's what, deconstruction, disentangling, expansion that Mike talked about of our worldview and faith and ideologies, that starts to happen. And pretty quickly, you find yourself on the outside of evangelicalism. But to Carrie's point earlier, what she experienced, many of them that I talked to, they're not ready to give up on Jesus yet. A lot of them aren't ready to give up on church or even scripture yet. 40 million Americans have left church in the last 25 years, 40 million. And I would say so many of them did so because of one of those little things that just didn't work anymore, but I think that the reason that the post-evangelical collective work that we are all doing and the churches that we lead or support or care for matter so much is because these evangelical refugees mostly don't have anywhere to go.
Yeah.
And they're looking for spaces. And so how do we continue to provide spaces or even just recognize the spaces that have already existed or existed for a long time, elevate those, and make sure people are aware of these spaces where they can safely deconstruct, reconstruct, disentangle, broaden their faith, while being fully loved and cared for and spurred on toward love and good deeds, as Scripture talks about.
So I'm about to jump to the Post-Evangelical Collective and its national gathering coming up. But let me lead in with this more personal question. So we've all experienced this personally as we've talked about it. We're now experiencing it religiously, culturally. There's plenty of podcasts and books by evangelicals who are now writing on the deconstruction movement, post-evangelicalism. You can turn on YouTube, TikTok, YouTube stories, go to Amazon, and there's now plenty of books written by evangelicals and podcasts by evangelicals talking about the dangers, the heresy, the untruth of this progressive Christian deconstruction, evolving Christianity, all of which I think terms we would agree might be colloquial and not good at the same time, and very much in transition. So how does it make you feel personally, based on your personal spiritual experience, when our old evangelical friends or the greater evangelical detractors say, we've lost our faith, we've lost our way, we've lost our connection to God, or as I think, Zach, you cited a friend and mentor of yours saying, I don't looked you in the face and said, I don't even think you're really a Christian. Or this other trope, which would be, I saw a well-known evangelical apologist debating, I'll use me as an illustration. How do you reckon a guy like David Perez, who was a minister for 30 years and then is no longer an evangelical, a Bible believing Christian. And the answer, and now not me, the illustration was, he must have not ever really been a Christian at all. Spiritual regeneration must have not really happened by the Holy Spirit. So, what does your own heart say? Not so much reactive to that, but did your faith grow? Did your love grow? Did your compassion grow? Did your attachment, connection, attunement to Christ, did all that grow when others were saying you're a heretic and saying, I think you lost your way or lost your faith? How does all that, how have you responded to that? Or how all that make you feel? This is where I'll edit the podcast.
I don't want to be the first one to jump in. Let Carrie
Okay, go, Mike.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah, I'd say yes, and yes to all, like, growth, expansion, more committed to Christ in the way of like, I think all those things have been true for me. And as Carrie was saying earlier, like, more freedom to figure that out, to have curiosity, more curiosity around that, all of that. I like to say, like, I was always told in the church that you should pursue truth wherever it leads you. But what they meant by that is you should pursue truth wherever it leads you, as long as it's one of these 2 or 3 conclusions. And so there's been something like, when I left my church, I called up one of my old professors who's become a friend, an old undergrad professor who's a philosophical theologian. And I was like, hey, can you recommend some books on epistemology? Because, like, I feel like I need to, like, re-examine the way that I have thought about how do I know what I know. And I feel like I need to, like, re-look at that, because I think that there's been some stuff that's been in the way of that. And anyways, I mean, I feel like it's been a really, really meaningful journey for me to figure out what it looks like to move in a way. Rohr uses the language of transcend and include. And, like, I think about that in terms of, like, I think, David, you've done some work around spiral dynamics. Some stuff. Yeah. And so I think of that with spiral dynamics and, like, moving to this place where, like, I've just been able to have space to grow with a greater capacity and have space for the people who aren't where I'm at, and not need them to need me. Like, they might need me to be somewhere else, but I don't need them to need me to be there. And that's been really helpful and freeing for me.
I would say similar and really differently. Part of my own journey was even, like, theological reconstruction and therapy and trauma work and family of origin story work. And even as a woman who was socialized and cultured within a system that very much wanted me to be sort of disconnected within, reconnecting some of those, the internal connection to intuition and to the Spirit's voice and inside of me, and to the earth through grounding practices, and through to my brothers and sisters. It's there's been so much reconnection there that I can really with authenticity say, like, I probably am not a Christian according to those definitions, and I'm okay with that, and I don't need that external validation and endorsement. I think my experience of the divine and my like confoundment with the life and ministry and teachings and person of Jesus, and the sort of life, the kingdom of God that Jesus came to establish, I think it's a different paradigm. I would even go so far as to say, like, my fundamental understanding of the gospel is a different value proposition than the one I was given. Like fire insurance, not going to hell, the conversion experience, all of those. I don't think I've left them. Maybe it's been a redefinition or an expansion of those. And so I don't even think I find myself, and I have to be cautious of this. Like, is this the Enneagram 8 in me? Or is this, like, I don't feel triggered by that sort of you're not a Christian anymore, or it doesn't count, or because probably according to their system, it doesn't. And I'm okay with that. And I don't feel like I need that legitimization or endorsement or validation, nor do I feel like I need to change their minds. But I do still feel the weight of how they experience me, and Christ in me matters. And so, like, one of my mentors says that we get to sort of be like Harriet Tubman, like helping free people and find a path out of that system and that structure. And so I want to live sort of invitationally in this new space and make space for people who are not there yet and help them, work out their own salvation with fear and trembling, as I've done with my own. But I don't know. I don't find like triggery consequences or weight in that sort of language. And in fact, I'm like, oh, you're probably right. But I probably am not a Christian according to your standard, and that's okay.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that's really good. I would just add, for me, I could only get called a heretic so many times before I was like, am I being a heretic? And I don't think that's a bad thing. I guess I would say, both. I don't know if it's a bad thing to be called a heretic anymore, but also I don't know if it's a bad thing to have the humility to engage with your own assuredness.
Yeah.
I think that's a positive thing, and I think that we should always be open to critique and critical feedback, so that we humbly continue to re-engage with our beliefs and behaviors and the systems that we both participate in and try to build in these new spaces, because it would be really easy to leave behind some of the more hot button theological or social things that, most of us agree that evangelicalism sucks at, but rebuild all the same systems and structures and levels of fundamentalism that still perpetuate a lot of the same issues, just in a more progressive way.
That's right.
And so I think it's important to stay humble and grounded and introspective, and invite critique on some level, especially from trusted partners in this work. I will say, realizing the inherent blind spots that come with being a, cishet white male, are numerous, and without having really lovely, dear friends in my life who will call me on things, push back against things that I'm teaching or saying or postures that I have, I'm just going to end up doing the same things that I tried to leave before, just in kind of, cooler, more progressive ways. And that's pretty much the last thing that I want to do. So I do think there's an element to this that, we need to stay humble and introspective and invite critique from beloved folks.
I think that's yes. I think all of us agree. The very thing we want to do is become kind of then reverse fundamentalists. That we changed our container, but we just we just poured in a different potion, but it's still rigid. And by the way, as far as being heretics, you're in good company on this podcast, because if you remember your church history class in seminary, one of the great heresies of the church is iconoclasm. So here you are on this podcast. Have you guys ever heard of the theory preference falsification? Have you ever heard that theory?
No.
It's an economic theory, but basically what preference falsification is this, and it works religiously or any communal group, is that people will keep they will falsify their preferences, what they really think and what they believe, if they think the greater community will judge them. So they have preferences, they have beliefs, but they don't mention them because they know, right, there'll be some excommunication in some way. But as that outside community changes, as it's safer to come out into the light because more people give up their falsification and start to speak, then more and more people start to go, I can now start to say what I think and believe because there's more people like me out there and I see them. So that's preference falsification, and I think this is what is happening, partly what we're seeing. And you all are part of a great part of that. Each one of you is the co-founders of the Post-Evangelical Collective. So tell us real quick what that is, apart from its national gathering, but then tell us about, I think it will be now the third national gathering coming up. Is that right? So first, what is the Post-Evangelical Collective? Because there might be some clergy out there wearing funny noses and glasses that need to know there's there's a group of clergy, influencers, pastors, people like them that go, hey, we're out there. So what is the PEC and what is this national gathering in Raleigh coming up? Let's hear from the executive director.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Sure.
Carrie Lattiser.
I mean, precisely what you just said, David. The PEC is a contingent of folks, pastors, church leaders, artists, stakeholders in the church who have felt ecclesiologically homeless in the sort of predominant model of church in the West. And some of these folks have been at this work of reimagining what church is, what the redemptive community is, how to be redemptive presence for years on their own. Many of them, like Zach and Mike, in different ways have been, disaffiliated and kicked out of their denomination or ordination and have been trying to carve a new path. And so part of what's happened, none of us set out to start the Post-Evangelical Collective. It sort of started with an idea from Mike, and it's been sort of collecting and connecting people who have already been on this journey, connecting them to one another. We dream of resourcing them and launching more post-evangelical churches as well. But essentially, it's a collective of people who have felt homeless in the predominant model and have sort of come together around a shared set of values that we've done some work over the last couple of years to articulate. We're currently sort of pushing against, belief statement, doctrinal statement, just with the sensibility. It's an indigenous sensibility that what you believe is embodied in how you behave. And so we've just sort of said, if we can be people that seek to embody these values collectively, there's all sorts of different implications and applications in the local church context. One of the pastors in this space, I think, says his church is liturgically promiscuous, and that feels like that's a kind of a helpful descriptor. Like, you would find lots of difference within the churches, pastors, leaders in this space, but scholars, more and more scholars are emerging and saying, hey, we want to be a part of this and contribute to this. So it's sort of this ragtag group of misfits who have been kicked out or who have opted out and are dreaming about a different way of embodying the ways of Jesus in the world.
Mm-hmm. And full disclosure, I've been part of the Post-Evangelical Collective for a number of years. Mike found me, and I think it was just a couple handfuls of us back then, Mike. But if there are other clergy wondering or looking, if there are church planters that are looking to move in this space or come out into the light, this is the national gathering is a great place to do that. Would you correct? And tell us about that. That's going to be held next month in Raleigh, North Carolina. Do I have the dates right? It's April 16th and 17th in Raleigh, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'll be there.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. And do I have this right? And Carrie, this is me retelling the story. So it's you certainly go. I'm going to retell a story about your life that day I met you. So if you go, no, that's not what it was. But when I met you at I think the first national gathering of the Post-Evangelical Collective, you were at a large evangelical church, and in your sense, you were walking into that gathering with a funny glasses and nose and mustache, kinda, sorta. Is that right? Ish.
Um, no, I thought I was living in the light, and I was hired at that church to lead the largest female-led church in North America to become a post-evangelical church. Like we had talked about the values and inclusion and affirmation and celebration and leaning into pursuing racial justice in our city and collectively and across the globe and cultivating a faith space of mutuality and flourishing. Like all of those things were in our shared imagination when I started at that church. And I think, so I was working at that church the day that I met you. So I was there to like meet other people on the journey and be more equipped to do that. And around that same time discovered our appetite and capacity to count the cost of that was quite different. And that
Mm.
church at the end of the day, I mean, even hiring a woman in that role, I had asked a lot of questions about how prepared they were. And I think they were really excited and eager, but had not kind of counted the cost. And
Yeah.
so I thought I was coming to fully live into, the fullness of the expression of those values of the post-evangelical collective, and then spent kind of a year and a half since we met, maybe a year and a half, um, navigating the dissonance and really moving towards a place of acceptance of, okay, we don't share an imagination or an
Mm.
appetite or capacity to count the cost to fully live into that. And so I left that church almost a year ago now and have stepped more fully into the space.
Yeah, yeah. And Zach, you're the lead pastor of, there's not many churches in this space in the United States. That's the reality. And by the way, this is my bad calculation, but here goes. Take a listen. I think there's 700,000 clergy in the United States, and that includes Protestant ministers and pastors, Catholic priests, but it also includes rabbis and imams. I think there's 700,000 clergy. When you then, at least in Christendom, when you even separate main line out of that and evangelical, I go, I don't, of that 700,000, I don't even know how many, the minuscule number that would be somebody like you or the three of you. And I'll include myself. There's just not many churches like this in the United States, and you lead a formidable one that's having tremendous influence in this space in Austin, Texas. So I ask you, and Mike, you chime in too, because you've been quite a gatherer of ministerial and clergy in this space. What is happening amongst clergy in this space in America? Zach, are more and more churches like yours, like mine, Mike, are more and more clergy like you have gathered? Is this growing and growing? Do they need to know the PEC exists for them? What is happening out there in the landscape?
Why don't you go first, Mike? I think you've got a
Oh,
better handle on this.
yeah, I don't know if I do or not. I mean, it's definitely, I don't know if it's growing or we're just becoming more aware of each other. So I don't know which one of those is true in my experience, but I feel like I regularly become more and more aware of more and more folks who are in this space. And one of our friends, Jason Miller, who leads a great church in South Bend, he says that like what we've been doing is essentially like there's a whole bunch of people wandering around in the wilderness, and then like we're shooting a flare up in the sky, and then people are finding that flare and finding their way towards each other. And now it feels like we kind of like there's a few of us shooting up flares, and now there's a whole lot more people shooting up flares. So then there's a whole lot more people who are able to see those and start finding each other. So I think that there are not as many folks in the space as we would hope would be true, but there are more than we think there are.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. That was my experience. I got connected to Mike through Michael Hidalgo, who leads a church like this in Denver. We had connected, and he said, you got to meet this guy, Mike Goldsworthy. He's gathering some pastors. This would have been, I don't know, late 2020 or early 2021, maybe. Probably late 2020. And we had a Zoom call, and the experience felt like Mike kind of giving language to what we were doing. And me feeling very alone, our church feeling very alone, and Mike saying, you're not alone. I talk with people every day who are doing similar things, and there's more of you out there than you think. And so taking off my, like co-founder board member hat for the PEC, just my experience as a local church post-evangelical pastor has been so life-giving for me, for the rest of our team. I'm bringing like 8 people to Raleigh next month because our folks love this. They love the connection. They love to see the movement that's happening and to know that they're not alone. The Nick at Night conversation I referenced from earlier that I had yesterday, I invited him to the gathering, and I think he's going to come. And it's one of those things that you mentioned with the false preference falsification.
Yeah.
I think that is bound up in a lot of evolutionary psychology, right? Of we're pack animals, right? And
Yeah,
if you leave
that's
the
right.
pack, you're getting picked off by a saber-toothed tiger or something, right? So like we have this thing inside of us that says like at all costs stay in the community. But if that community is increasingly toxic, it's increasingly harmful to you and to people that you deeply care about, and that is paired with, oh, there's another community that I can be a part of, that's where I think we start to see real movement. And so that's my hope. That's my experience 4 years ago or so. And that's my hope with the future of this collective, is that more and more people would see the flare going up and that it would be life-saving, like it has been for me.
Yeah. So, Carrie, I know the PEC has a website. So, if there are folks, I think they can go to the website if they want to look for a church in their area. Is that right? And then they can also register for the conference in Raleigh. Tell us about that.
Precisely. Yeah, they can look for a local post-evangelical church in their area. If there are pastors listening who say, oh, I align with these values, I fit in this space, and they want to explore becoming, like listing their church, becoming a post-evangelical church, there's an option for that. And then certainly there's all sorts of information about the gathering. I'll say part of what we want to accomplish at the gathering, it will not be like maybe other Christian conferences. We're not going to have experts on the stage talking about the 7 steps to success. It'll be a lot more, hopefully equipping, more conversational, more shared learning. It'll be much more like a dialogue than a monologue on stage. And the whole point is to convene people, to connect them with one another, to dream and imagine together. We'll certainly learn and grow, name some things from our history, identify some things in the rearview mirror that should shape where we're headed, and hopefully leave invigorated for the journey and less alone on the journey together.
Good. Well, if you live in the Austin, Texas area, go visit Zach and his wonderful church, Restore Austin. You can find them online, but it's an amazing place doing amazing things. Mike, you are in the LA, Orange County area. If there's folks listening there, where are some good, with this what are some great places, churches they can check out in Southern California?
Yeah, there's actually several in Southern California. There's a church our friend Kevin Ha, who's on the board with us, founded, called New City Church in LA. There's a church here in Long Beach called City Church Long Beach. There's a church in Orange County called Safe Haven. That was a church plant from City Church Long Beach. Yeah, there's a handful of great churches in the area. Oh, New Abbey, which is
New
up in
Abbey.
Glendale.
Yep.
Can I
Yep.
also, Mike's plugging churches in his area, but I also want to plug Mike for a minute, who we call the bishop, if that's okay. I think each of us have benefited from reaching out
Yes.
to Mike to say, Would you be a present listener? Would you be a prophetic voice? Would you be an encourager for the journey? Leadership coaching, consulting. I think wherever people who are listening are in their own journey of kind of wrestling and working out the implications of transformation, of deconstruction or reconstruction, Mike has been a profound resource to me and probably everyone in the PEC. So that's another reason to reach out to Mike if that's you listening.
Yes,
kind of-
yes,
I just want to second that really quick.
Yes.
The humble Godfather, Mike Goldsworthy.
Yes.
Yeah, we brought in Mike to Restore this fall, and he led us through multi-day visioneering type process that was completely tailored to like who we are, our vision, our values, the post-evangelical work, and helped shepherd us to moving to 2 gatherings in January, to hiring another staff person currently. And honestly, like we still reference those days and ongoing conversations with Mike. And it was transformative for our church. So, very grateful for him and his work.
Yes, I agree. And Mike, you can be found where? At mikegoldsworthy.com?
There you go.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yep. Great.
Stop by my house in Long Beach.
Yeah,
Combine
yeah. And yes, and I'll also say if you're in the Nashville area, Sparrow Day and Grace Point, will the national conference is in Raleigh, hosted by Church on Morgan. Will the PEC still seek to do its regionals through the 2024 year? I know we'll be leading ours in the fall, but
In October, right? In
yep,
Nashville.
October 1. Yes.
Yeah, we're really hoping to empower and decentralize some of that, but the hope is that there would be an opportunity to continue to connect with leaders within proximity, regionally all over the country. And we even have some stuff happening around the world. So like folks in Denmark that are doing some regional gatherings. We're going to have a moment at the national gathering where folks can connect with others in their region as well. We hope to continue to perpetuate that kind of local connection and actually dream of, like, there's some awesome stuff happening with Zach and in Texas, that where there's like shared vision for what could happen in the city when we connect. So yeah, there's lots of more of that to come, we hope.
Good. Well, you three are certainly iconoclasts and making a difference in this space, and I really, really appreciate you being on the podcast. And I hope others will see you in Raleigh next month, April 16th and 17th. Go to the PEC, postevangelical.com.
Postevangelicalcollective.org. You got it.
.org. Post-evangelical, and I'll put it across, but postevangelicalcollective.org, and you can get tickets there. Thanks, you guys. Thanks for being on this
David,
podcast.
can I just say before we get off, like,
yes,
you have been such an important voice in this space too, and I hope folks know that. Like, I appreciate on podcasts where you're like asking questions and deferring, but like you have offered so much here. You've given up so much. You have been like, I often say, like, on the innovation curve, I think this space is moving from innovators to early adopters, and early adopters are looking for innovators to like spark their imagination. And you have been one of the innovators that have been out on the forefront, just kind of like you're in a forest and there's no clear path forward, and you're just kind of like with a machete whacking away, like making a path forward so that others can like see a way. And yeah, I'm just so grateful, like really, really am, for like all that you've done. And I'm really grateful that like for all that's happening at Sparrow Day now too. Like there's really beautiful things happening there right now.
oh, that's kind, Mike. Thank
We're
you.
grateful
Thank you.
for
Thank
you, David.
Yes.
Thanks for
Well,
your
Yeah,
partnership.
ditto.
yes, and yes. Thank you for the friendship, and I can't wait to see and celebrate with you all in Raleigh. Thanks, guys. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us on, man.
Thanks, David.